Do you want to make a cute dress for a special occasion? Well, let me show you this updated Alba dress. So we have had this sewing pattern in our store for quite some time already, but then my mom started to work on this knitted cardigan and I instantly saw that I want to wear this cardigan together with the Alba dress. But I felt like I want to go a little extra, so I added this bow around the neck. The only thing I couldn't decide about was whether I want to keep this dress backless or I want to make it more covered. That's why I made a few sketches and I put them in our Instagram and I let our followers to decide. The votes were very diverse, so I decided to make both options. By the way, we regularly do polls in our Instagram account, so if you want to be a part of our decision-making process, then go and check us there. In this video, I will be showing how to make the backless option, and for the more covered version there will be a separate video because I am going to use slightly different sewing methods for that one, and I didn't want to make this video a mess between two different styles. So let's make it happen.
I will rate the sewing project as advanced beginner because I will be using French seams. Don't get me wrong, the French seams aren't anything extremely difficult, but they do take a bit more time and a bit more precision. So, if you call yourself a beginner, but you do have some patience, then you can absolutely make this dress. The neckline is slightly gathered, as well as the ties around the neck. I pressed on interfacing on the ties for this pink dress. That's why the bow is keeping its shape so well. However, you can also skip the interfacing to get more softer look. Here's a small video from the other version of this pattern, and as you can see, the ties are very soft and it gives possibilities to wrap them around your neck in other ways. I will be using the Alba dress sewing pattern, which you can find in our Etsy or in our online store. You can find a link down in the description. Also, you will need a fabric that drapes quite well. I chose this polyester satin, but you can also choose silk or viscose. A matching thread, of course, and an elastic band which is up to 7 mm wide. If you want to make that statement bow, then you will need an interfacing. Since I will be using French seams, I am going to use only sewing machine straight stitch. And now let's cut out all the pattern details. To be honest, I bought this fabric before I even thought about the design of this dress. That's why I am really squeezing in all the pieces. All our patterns come with an illustrated tutorial file, and there you can find the suggested pattern layout for your size. Make sure to check the straight grain guideline. Most of the details are cut on bias, but some of them, such as the back bow details, are cut in straight grain. And don't forget to cut the notches. Cut them around 3 to 4 mm into the fabric, or use a soap or a marker. This step will help us later to easier match the details. If you prefer the bow detail to be more structured, then let's cut out the interfacing now. On the back bow pattern detail, you will find 2 notches. Fold or cut off the paper pattern where those notches are. And now put the shorter bow detail on the interfacing and cut out. I am not using the interfacing on the whole bow detail because there will be gathering on the side neck seams, and it's nicer that the fabric around the neck stays soft. So I suggest putting interfacing only where we will tie the bow. Press on the interfacing. And now let's imagine a bit how the finished bow will look like. And also here you can see the difference between the part that has the interfacing and the part that doesn't have it. Just in case, don't forget to do it with the other bow detail as well. Now we are ready to start sewing the dress. Lay both back panels with wrong sides together. And yes, I said it correctly with the wrong sides together because we are going to use the French seams. Pin the middle back seam. Stitch 1 cm apart from the edge. I am flattening the seam at first and then I am pressing the seam towards one side. It doesn't matter much to which side you are pressing it. Now take your scissors and trim off 7 mm of the seam allowance. Leave around 3 mm of the seam allowance and be careful not to cut off too much. Fold the fabric so the right sides are together. Use your fingers and try to bring the seam towards the edge as close as possible and press. I highly recommend not to skip this step because it will be way much easier to sew the next seam and get a very professional looking French seam. And right now I will add some pins just to better fix both layers in place. Stitch 5 mm apart from the edge. Do not worry if the seam isn't looking very flat at the moment. That's because this dress is cotton bias and the fabric is playing its jokes. So we will simply flatten it out with an iron. And after that, press the seam towards one side. This is how it should look like, and I think that a bit of extra work has been totally worth it. Now let's work on the side seams. Lay the front panel together with the back panel. Wrong sides are facing each other. Pin both side seams. Stitch 1 cm apart from the edge. Press the side seams towards one side. And let's repeat the same steps we did previously. Trim off 7 mm of the seam allowance and then take these seams and fold on half, so try to bring the seam as close to the edge as possible and press. Stitch 5 mm apart from the edge. Firstly, press the seams to flatten them out and then press those seams towards the back panel. Now let's work with the facing details. We will actually do exactly the same work we just did for the dress panels. The only difference is that the seams will be shorter. So lay both back-facing details with the wrong sides together and stitch the middle seam 1 cm apart from the edge. Press it towards one side and again trim off 7 mm. Fold the fabric and press the seams towards edge as close as possible. Stitch 5 mm apart from the edge. Flatten the seam and then press it towards the opposite side compared to the dress panel's back middle seam. Lay together the front-facing panel with the back-facing panel so the wrong sides are facing each other. Pin the side seams and let's do the French seams here as well. Stitch both facing side seams 1 cm apart from the edge. You probably already know what to do next. So press the seams towards one side, trim off 7 mm of the seam allowance and then fold the facing details at these seams. Press these seams as close to the edge as possible. After that, stitch 5 mm apart from the edge. Now, press the side seams towards the front panel. I don't know what came over me, I pressed them towards the wrong direction, but do it opposite as I did. While we are here, let's work on the facings hem. I will be using a baby hem. Fold 1 cm of the hem and then stitch around 2 mm apart from the edge. In general, it's totally okay if you simply neaten the facings hem. You can use a zigzag stitch or a serger stitch. I chose the baby hem because previously we used the French seams, which gives a pretty luxurious result, so I decided to stick with this sophisticated sewing style. However, other neatening methods still work very well, and from the outside no one will be able to tell the difference. I will quickly press the hem because I feel that later it's easier to work with it. Take sharp scissors and trim off the excessive amount of the seam allowance. Be very careful not to cut the main fabric and not to cut in the stitch. Now take the hem and fold it again. Stitch 2 to 3 mm apart from the edge. Press around the facings hem. As you can see, this dress took me several days to film. So let's work with the straps now. Take both details and fold it on half so the right sides are facing each other. Sew along the edge as I am showing. So the one end of the strap will be closed, but the other one will be left open. Stitch 5 to 7 mm apart from the edge. Trim off the corners at the closed end because later it will be easier to flip it and get it very nice and smooth. And trim off the excessive seam allowance. Leave 3 mm. To turn the strap from the inside out, find and use a small stick that doesn't have a sharp corner. I will be using a bobby pin. I simply kinda straighten it out and then I am pushing the closed end of the strap towards inside. Press both straps. Try to bring the seam as close to the edge as possible. After you have finished to press, then take the open edge of the strap and match it together with the notches at the dress back panel. Lay the straps horizontally because that's the way you will tie the small bow later. Fix these straps in the place either by pinning or you can even stitch like 5 millimeters apart from the edge. Take the facing detail and put it on the dress panels so the right sides are facing each other. Start by matching the seams and pin. Here you can see why I suggested to press the facings and dresses seams in opposite directions. This way the seam we are going to make will be less bulky. After you have matched the seams, add more pins to secure the facing in place. Stitch starting from the one point of the neckline until the other point of the neckline. Now we will need to understitch the facing. So pull the facing towards up. You will need to understitch all around where I am showing. Find the seam we just made and push the seam allowance towards the facing. And then stitch 2 millimeters apart from the seam we just made. Take the scissors and make a few snips in the seam allowance. Be very careful not to cut the previous seams. As well, of course, don't cut in the facing or dress panels itself. Make those snips at an angle and cut them more often where the line is more curved. Also, I cut off the part where there is the French seam because it was giving a lot of thickness. This step is very important because it helps to release the tension in the fabric. And later we will flip the facing towards inside and it will be way much easier to nicely press the edge. Now flip the facing towards inside. As you can see, it doesn't look very beautiful at the moment. That's why we need to very carefully press the edge. Use our fingers to put the seam where it needs to be and try to press it in a way that the facing isn't visible from the outside. Now you can see how nice and flat this edge is becoming. If we skipped the snipping previously in the seam allowance, then it would be a completely different story. This is how the end result should look like. Currently the facing is free-flowing, that's why we should secure it in the place. A quick and easy way is to join the facing together with the dress panel seam allowances. Match the facing seam with the dress seam and pin. Now take the seam allowance of the dress and you will need to stitch it together with the facing's hand. You can either do it by sewing machine or stitch it by hand. Do the step for both side seams and for the back's middle seam. Just so you know, if we skip this step, then later when you will be wearing this dress, the facing will start to come out and it's quite annoying. So I think it's worth to invest these extra 5 minutes. I am stitching by hand because I found out that it's quite difficult for me to get there with my sewing machine. But if you can get there with the sewing machine, feel free to do it. The main thing is that the stitch isn't visible from the outside. As you can see, I am stitching in a very small area. The main thing is to hold together the facing with the dress panel. Now let's start working on the bow panels. Lay the front bow panel together with the back bow panel with the right sides together. Pin the side seams, just in case these will be the regular seams, not the French seams. Stitch 1 cm apart from the edge. Press the seams towards the back bow panels. Now take your elastic band and cut off two pieces that are 10 cm long. You will need to sew on the elastic band on the seam allowance and it will make a nice gathering. So take the seam allowance and pin the elastic band at the top and at the bottom. When sewing, you will need to stretch out the elastic band and make a stitch at the middle. As you can see, the stitch is done only on the seam allowance, therefore there will be no visible seam on the right side. And don't forget to do it with the other next side seam as well. Find the both notches at the middle and fold 1 cm of the seam allowance and press it. Do it only for one side. This step later will make easier to join the bow to the dress panel. Fold the bow panel on half so the right sides are facing. Pin the tails of the bow starting from the angled corner until the notch. You will need to stitch along that edge. Also pin the other side of the tail, the same thing starting from the notch until the corner. It is very important that you leave that opening starting from one notch to another because the dress panel will be going in there. Take your scissors and cut off the seam allowance at the corners. If we skip this step now, then later when we will flip this bow detail from inside out, there will be a lot of bulking going on and it will be impossible to get sharp corners. Use some sort of a stick and turn it from the inside out through the opening at the middle. Let's be real, at the moment they are looking quite ugly. So I will show you two options how to get the edges perfectly sharp. One way to do it is to use a hand stitch. Take a thread in a different color and put it in a needle. Use your fingers to bring the seam as close to the edge as possible and then stitch by fixing the seam in the place. Each stitch can be around 1 centimeter long. It doesn't have to be too fine, but the main thing is to hold everything together. If you find it difficult to push the seam with your fingers, you can also use the needle. Try to lightly catch the seam and push it upwards. Work in this way for the rest of the bow. I recommend this method for those who are more on the beginner level. I know it feels like a lot of work, but firstly, it will help you to not burn your fingers when you will be ironing later. And secondly, if you do it, I guarantee that the result will be so great that no one will believe that you are not a professional dressmaker. Here I am using a needle to bring the corner towards outside as much as possible, but be careful not to destroy the fabric. Now simply press this edge. When you have done it, then continue by pressing all over the bow. Use your fingers or pliers to take the stitch out. One such not so amazing thing about this method is that sometimes the hand stitch threads have left markings after the pressing. If that's your case, then press and use steam and the markings will disappear. And now I will show the other method for those who are feeling more comfortable with the iron. Similarly as we did for the facing, use your fingers and bring the seam as close to the edge as possible. Hold the seam with your fingers and press. Just be very careful not to put the iron too close to your fingers. For the corners, I will use a needle to push the seam towards the edge. It's quite hard to do it with the fingers only. On the right side, you can see me being overly confident leaving the iron in this position for this long. And now press all over the bow. If you are making the option of this dress that doesn't have a bow, then you will simply need to fold the neckline 2 times and stitch 1 centimeter apart from the edge. It will create a tunnel and later you will put the strap through it. But since here we are making the version of the bow, then you will need to do 2 gathering stitches along the neckline. Set the stitch length to the number 4 and remember to not do the back stitch. Stitch 5 mm apart from the edge. Leave long tails of the thread. And now make another stitch right next to the previous one, around 2 mm apart from it. I will mark the middle part of the neckline to easier match it with the bow panel, as well as the middle part of the bow's opening. As you can see, the opening is smaller than the neckline, and we need to gather the neckline until it becomes the same length as the bow's opening. Use your fingers or pliers to pull the threads and make the gathering. It is very important that you pull only two threads from one side, otherwise if you will be pulling all four then nothing will happen. Since the beginning of the seam is more thicker because there's the facing and the seam allowances, it's slightly harder to pull the threads at the beginning, but be patient and very careful not to break the threads, it will eventually start together. Pin the dress right side together with the bow panels right side. Now match the middle markings as well as the edges of the neckline with the openings and then adjust the gathering to the length that's needed. Make sure that the gathering is even. Stitch 1 centimeter apart from the edge. The stitch should go exactly from one notch to the another. Don't forget to set your sewing machine stitch length back to normal. Now take a look from the dress right side and check whether there are visible gathering stitches. Since I do have some visible threads, I will take them out. I will use a seam ripper and carefully take out the gathering threads. Be very careful not to cut the seam we just made. Lightly press the seam upwards. I am using the very edge of the ironing board because in this way it is easier to access the seam and not to press too hardly on the gathered part. This is the last step to join the bow. Fold over the seam allowance you previously pressed in a way that it's covering all the stitches we have made there. You can use the stitch in a ditch method, but I will actually hand stitch because I don't want any stitches to be even slightly visible from the right side, and this seam is so short that the hand stitching actually will be a quicker option. I start pinning to secure the bow in the place and then I take a needle with the thread in the same color. I am using a pretty simple invisible hand stitch. I am joining together the bow part with the dress facings part. At this moment, you can try this dress on and decide whether you like the length. Remember that the seam allowance will take another 2 centimeters, so it will be slightly shorter. If you want it to be even more shorter, then simply cut off the excessive amount. And we are almost finished. We just need to do the hem. One way to do it is to use a double folded hem. Simply fold 1 centimeter and then fold 1 centimeter again and then stitch around. But since I am going for this very delicate look, I will use the baby hem again. So fold 1 centimeter and stitch 2 millimeters apart from the edge. Trim off the excessive amount of the seam allowance. Fold the seam again and stitch 3 millimeters apart from the edge. Now give the final press and you have finished. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel for more sewing and knitting tutorials. Bye!